What if I told you that stepping into a medieval dungeon was not just imprisonment? It was a slow-motion death sentence engineered with chilling precision. Beneath castles and churches far below the light of day lay chambers so cruel that surviving even 24 hours was a miracle. This was not punishment as we know it. This was systematic annihilation, where architecture itself became a weapon and silence was louder than screams. Before we descend into these cursed halls, make sure you subscribe to this channel because what you're about to learn will change the way you think about history forever. Forget the Hollywood images of wide stone cells with straw beds and barred windows. Real medieval dungeons were carefully designed to maximize human suffering. They were built underground, 30 or 40 feet deep, where no sunlight could intrude and no cries could reach the surface. Each wall, curve, and corridor had a purpose to suffocate the spirit, to prolong despair, and to make the very act of breathing a torment. The horror began not with cruelty, but with reform. Around 800 AD, Charlemagne's legal codes first made imprisonment a legitimate punishment, not just a temporary holding cell before trial. At first, the chambers were crude, shallow basements used to detain criminals. But when rulers noticed that slow imprisonment crushed people more effectively than swift execution, the dungeon began to evolve. A discovery had been made: suffering could be stretched into weeks, even months, and this served power better than death itself. By the 11th century, nearly every castle, monastery, and city had its own dungeon, and yet the real transformation came from the church itself. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued the bull Ad Extirpanda, formally sanctioning torture to extract confessions from heretics. This was no rogue decree, it was official doctrine. Torture was reframed as divine mercy, saving the soul by destroying the body. Compassion itself was weaponized into cruelty. Once this door had opened, the craft of dungeon design flourished. Master builders traveled from fortress to fortress, exchanging ideas, the way architects now exchange blueprints. They did not compete to make palaces taller or bridges stronger. They competed to make cells darker, chambers more suffocating, and devices more efficient in breaking the human body. It was a profession of shadows, a craftsmanship of suffering. The oubliette, a French invention, became the most terrifying symbol of this era. Shaped like a bottle carved into solid rock and accessible only through a hole in the ceiling, it was a space designed for complete erasure. Prisoners were lowered and abandoned and quite literally forgotten. No trial, no execution, no burial. Just silence, darkness, and hunger, until death became the only release. Each dungeon had its own specialty, like a grotesque franchise of horror. The Tower of London perfected public theater, where noble prisoners were displayed humiliated, and then executed with symbolic ceremony. The Château d'If in France pioneered drowning chambers rooms with adjustable water levels that rose slowly day by day, creating an endless terror of drowning that lasted weeks. In Rome, Castel Sant'Angelo carved oubliettes into its foundations, some of which would flood with rain, forcing prisoners to live with the constant fear of water rising around them in the dark. Architecture itself was transformed into an instrument of madness. Some chambers were designed with false floors that collapsed into pits of spikes. Others amplified the sound of dripping water until it echoed like hammer blows in the skull. Corridors narrowed into suffocating passageways that made air feel scarce. The goal was not simply to restrain the body. It was to unravel the mind, to grind down the will until death felt merciful. But it wasn't only the architecture that made dungeons lethal. It was the laws that filled them. Crimes against the church, heresy. Witchcraft, blasphemy were impossible to disprove. Denial was proof of guilt. A failed harvest, a dead cow, or an untimely death in the village could condemn a woman as a witch. Poverty itself was criminalized. Vagrancy, idleness, begging were treated as threats to society. Even children as young as 7 could be tried and punished as adults, sent into the same pits as hardened criminals. Life inside was its own twisted society. At the top were nobles and high-value prisoners kept alive in tolerable conditions because they could be ransomed for fortunes. Straw replaced monthly bread and water supplied daily. They endured humiliation but survived. But for the common thief, the beggar, or the accused heretic, the dungeon was nothing but a slow-motion grave. 20 men might be crammed into a room for 5. They would receive moldy bread once in several days, drink foul water, and wait as disease spread faster than any executioner's blade. Disease was the true executioner in medieval dungeons. Typhus spread like wildfire through the lice that infested every prisoner's skin. Dysentery came from drinking water mixed with human waste. Tuberculosis thrived in airless chambers, each cough sending invisible daggers into the lungs of everyone nearby. Plague, the Black Death itself, found its perfect breeding ground in the filth. In some dungeons, mortality reached 90% within weeks. You didn't need a torturer, the walls themselves killed you. For women, the dungeon was a double punishment. Rape was endemic, committed by guards, fellow prisoners, and sometimes sanctioned by silence. Pregnancy inside a dungeon was not a blessing, it was a death sentence. There were no midwives, no clean rags, no water fit for a newborn. Mothers died in childbirth and infants perished within days. The dungeon became a grave for 2 lives at once. Children suffered most of all. Orphans accused of theft, beggars caught sleeping in the wrong place, boys who played in noble gardens, they were tossed into cells with hardened criminals. Mortality for children approached 95% in the first month. Those who survived learned to trade their small bodies for scraps of food or moments of protection, becoming victims of exploitation in order to cling to life a little longer. The dungeon economy was built on desperation. Clean straw cost a week's wages if families outside could bribe the guards. A cup of relatively clean water could ruin a household's savings. Fresh bread was more valuable than gold. Inside, survivors who lasted months became informal leaders controlling resources, demanding loyalty, and punishing the weak. The strong preyed on newcomers, stripping them of clothing, food, and dignity. And then came the devices. The strappado wrists tied behind the back, hoisted by rope, then dropped without warning. Shoulders dislocated, arms ripped from sockets, and yet the victim did not die. The Spanish boot, an iron casing tightened by screws, until shin bones cracked audibly, echoing through the cell like a nightmare symphony. The goal was not to kill quickly. It was to make death a distant horizon, always promised but never delivered. Psychological torments were as refined as the physical. Water torture with cloth across the face, simulating drowning without leaving a mark. Endless sleep deprivation lanterns lit guards prodding awake noises arranged to deny even a moment of rest. Victims confessed to anything just to close their eyes. Others were subjected to extremes of hot and cold, dragged from freezing cells into blazing furnaces of heat, their bodies never allowed to adjust. But here is the darkest revelation: cruelty was not random. It was systematized, codified, and taught. Monk scholars and legal experts wrote detailed manuals on how to inflict maximum pain while keeping victims alive. Torturers were trained like craftsmen, apprenticed in methods of breaking bones, tearing flesh, and shattering minds without accidental death. This was not chaos, it was bureaucracy of suffering. And yet, even without chains or boots, disease remained the undefeated executioner. Scurvy loosened teeth until they fell out one by one. Old wounds reopened, bleeding endlessly because the body could no longer heal. Gangrene spread through untreated injuries, filling cells with the sickly stench of rotting flesh. Some prisoners begged for death. Others deliberately exposed themselves to infection, seeking the mercy of an early grave. Corpses were treated as trash. Every week, if guards remembered, bodies were dragged from the cells, piled on carts, and dumped into mass graves. Sometimes they were fed to pigs. No names recorded, no prayers offered, no families informed. Entire lives vanished from the record as if they had never existed. Survivors watched and understood they too would be erased without memory. In this world, morality dissolved. Desperate prisoners betrayed each other for a crust of bread or a sip of water. They turned on the weak, beating them, stealing what little they had. Some even joined in the abuse, reasoning that cruelty was the only shield against becoming a victim themselves. The dungeon was more than a prison. It was a machine that corrupted everyone it touched, grinding humanity into dust. Different crimes demanded different punishments, and the church made sure every method was infused with symbolism. Heresy, witchcraft, and blasphemy were seen as attacks on the very order of the universe. These victims were not only tortured, they were spiritually crushed. To lift someone by the strappado was to demonstrate how their soul had been torn from God. To crush legs with the Spanish boot was to show the corruption spreading from within. Torture became a theater of morality. For political crimes, spectacle mattered more than pain alone. Drawing and quartering was the ultimate public display, dragged through the streets to symbolize disgrace, hanged until half dead to show judgment, disemboweled alive to expose supposed corruption, beheaded to sever authority, and quartered to erase identity entirely. Every stage carried meaning. Every cut was a message from the crown: resist, and this will be your fate. Skinning alive, flaying was reserved for the most serious offenses against rulers. Done slowly, skillfully, it could last for hours, with the victim conscious throughout. Muscles glistened, nerves screamed, and the crowd looked on as the body was peeled like fruit. It was not enough to punish. It had to terrify. The state demonstrated that it held not just power over land and law, but over the very existence of flesh. The brazen bull, a hollow bronze statue, turned suffering into grotesque performance. Victims were locked inside and roasted over fire. The acoustics twisted their screams into the bellowing of an enraged animal. To the crowd, the victim was dehumanized, transformed into a beast as they burned alive. It was cruelty wrapped in creativity, proof that medieval minds could invent horrors as easily as they built cathedrals. Not all tortures were hidden underground. Some were designed for the marketplace, where humiliation carried as much sting as pain. The pillory locked a prisoner's head and hands in wooden stocks, while crowds pelted them with rotten food stones and worse. The damage was not only physical but social, being marked as outcast before neighbors, family, and strangers. Shame, once inflicted, lingered longer than bruises. Women faced their own instruments of degradation. The scold's bridle, a metal mask fitted with spikes or plates, silenced women accused of gossiping or speaking too boldly. The ducking stool strapped women to a chair on a lever, plunging them underwater repeatedly until near drowning. Hours of gasping, choking, and cold water left many dead from shock or hypothermia. What passed as discipline was in truth ritualized misogyny. Psychological warfare became an art form. Victims were kept awake for days, hallucinating until they confessed to crimes they had never considered. Rooms were built to distort sound, a single dripping drop magnified into thunder, silence broken by sudden clangs that shattered sanity. Some prisoners retreated inward, inventing entire fantasy worlds just to survive. Others broke completely, babbling incoherently, their minds unraveling before their bodies. And then there was starvation. Prison rations were calculated not to sustain, but to prolong. Moldy bread, thin gruel, and foul water gave just enough energy to keep the body breathing while ensuring it weakened daily. Diseases like beriberi and scurvy followed. Gums bled, teeth dropped, bones ached, and muscles wasted. The body collapsed in slow motion each day, a new humiliation as flesh betrayed spirit. Overcrowding was not an accident of poor management. It was deliberate policy. Pack enough bodies into one cell and disease spread faster than any executioner's blade. Keep the air stagnant and the water filthy, and the dungeon itself did the killing. Authorities treated deaths as savings. Fewer mouths to feed, fewer guards, required fewer trials to conduct. Inhumanity was not a side effect, it was the system. Some of the most notorious dungeons became legends in their own time. The Tower of London earned its name as the Bloody Tower, where nobles awaited execution under the eyes of a fascinated public. The Bastille in Paris became synonymous with tyranny, a place where people vanished into silence without trial. Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome turned the tomb of an emperor into a torture chamber for heretics. These were not hidden mistakes. They were monuments to cruelty celebrated and feared alike. Take Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII. Just 3 years before she had walked through the Tower of London's gates as a queen preparing for coronation. Now she returned to those same rooms as a prisoner accused of adultery, incest, and treason. The irony was deliberate. Henry wanted her to taste the reversal of fortune. Her final execution was carried out by a French swordsman chosen to give her a merciful death compared to the axe. But the true punishment was psychological, knowing she would die in the very place where her triumph had begun. Thomas More, the great scholar and author of Utopia, endured a quieter torment. Imprisoned for refusing to acknowledge Henry's supremacy over the church, he was denied books, writing tools, and visitors. Deprived of the very things that defined his identity, he weakened not from lashes but from silence. When physical torture failed to break him, the dungeon simply eroded his body until illness did the rest. This was slow annihilation disguised as lawful punishment. The Bastille in Paris specialized not in torture devices, but in disappearance. With a sealed royal letter de cachet, the king could order anyone imprisoned indefinitely, no trial, no explanation. Families never knew what became of their loved ones. Some remained for decades, fading into shadows. The most mysterious case was the man in the iron mask, held for over 30 years, forced to wear a velvet mask to hide his identity. His punishment was not pain, but erasure. Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, once Hadrian's tomb, became the Pope's personal dungeon. Its irony was bitter, a pagan emperor's resting place repurposed to torment Christians accused of heresy. The philosopher Giordano Bruno was held here for 8 years before being burned alive in 1600. His crime was believing the universe had infinite worlds. The dungeon's oubliettes flooded during storms, and prisoners spent nights listening to rainwater rising around their feet, never knowing if it would drown them by dawn. The Château de Vincennes pioneered drowning chambers that could be filled or drained at will. Prisoners lived with the water lapping at their ankles, sometimes rising to their chests, depending on the mood of their keepers. The Marquis de Sade spent 13 years there, recording the psychological torture of never knowing when the water might rise to his mouth. It was terror on a timetable, prolonged, deliberate, merciless. These institutions were not isolated. Techniques were shared, adapted, perfected. Builders took pride in making prisons that silenced screams, chambers that amplified terror, corridors that crushed hope. Torture became a skilled trade with apprenticeships, standards, and innovations. The cruelty was not random, it was industrial. A network of human suffering that spread across Europe like a dark guild. And yet beneath all the cruelty, the most terrifying truth was how ordinary it all became. Dungeons were not aberrations hidden from society. They were part of it, supported by law, sanctioned by faith, justified by philosophy. People accepted them as natural, even necessary. The baker selling bread, the priest saying mass, the noble signing decrees, all were complicit, whether through belief or silence. For the guards, cruelty became routine. They sold straw water and favors as part of daily business. They laughed at screams, ignored corpses, and pocketed coins from desperate families. For them, the dungeon was not hell, it was employment. They went home to wives and children after a day of breaking bodies. The normalization of evil was perhaps the dungeon's most haunting legacy. Survivors rarely walked free unchanged. Those who did escape or were released carried scars deeper than wounds. Many never spoke of their time underground. Some lived with hallucinations that never ended, still hearing water dripping in silence, still feeling the airless weight of stone walls. The dungeon had infected their minds as surely as disease had infected their blood. The lesson of these dark halls is simple and terrifying. Civilization is fragile. Rights we take for granted today, fair trials, humane treatment, medical care, were not born of kindness, but of centuries of horror. Medieval dungeons remind us how easily compassion can become cruelty when sanctioned by law, and how quickly a society can build machines of suffering and call them justice. Imagine descending the narrow spiral staircases of a medieval castle torchlight flickering against damp stone. The air grows colder with each step, the smell of mold and waste tightening around your throat. By the time you reach the bottom, the sound of life above is gone. You are in another world now, one where time slows and every hour feels like a year. To enter was to be erased, and prisoners knew it the moment the last echo of the iron door slammed shut. The design of these spaces played tricks on the senses. Corridors curved so that you could never see where they ended. Ceilings pressed low enough to force you to stoop. Walls were built to muffle cries, yet amplify drips, turning a droplet into a relentless drumbeat. The dungeon was not simply confinement, it was a sensory assault designed to dismantle the mind inch by inch. Even light became a weapon. Some chambers were kept in perpetual darkness, plunging prisoners into blindness, forcing them to forget the cycle of day and night. Others were left with a single shaft of light that crept across the wall, taunting them with unreachable freedom. The absence or distortion of light became part of the torture hope dangled then extinguished. Survival strategies emerged among the captives. Some whispered prayers, constantly clinging to faith as their only shield. Others invented elaborate imaginary worlds holding entire conversations with people who weren't there. A few became informants, betraying fellow inmates for scraps of food or cleaner straw. The dungeon did not merely punish the body, it rewired morality, making cruelty a currency of survival. There were moments of twisted irony. A thief who had stolen bread might die starving in a dungeon. A heretic accused of questioning divine mercy was tortured by men who claimed to save his soul. A child condemned for idleness might be worked to death in forced labor. The absurdity was crueler than the pain. Law became theater, and the dungeon was its stage. The hierarchy of suffering was clear. Nobles might receive better food and cleaner quarters, but they were still stripped of dignity, paraded before crowds, and reminded that power could be revoked overnight. Commoners, meanwhile, were reduced to shadows, dying unnoticed in corners. Children were the lowest of all, robbed not just of freedom, but of any chance at a future. The dungeon made social order physical rank carved into flesh. Accounts from guards reveal chilling indifference. Some described prisoners as already dead once they crossed the threshold. Others joked about the ingenuity of devices, admiring how long a body could be stretched or how slowly bones could be crushed. To them, the dungeon was not horror, it was craft. Their words remind us that cruelty thrives not in monsters, but in men who see pain as ordinary. And yet, in rare cases, compassion flickered. A sympathetic guard might smuggle in extra food. A fellow prisoner might share a scrap of cloth for warmth. These moments did not undo the suffering, but they revealed the stubborn ember of humanity that refused to die completely. The tragedy was that such gestures were exceptions, whispers against the roar of institutional cruelty. By the late Middle Ages, dungeons had become infamous symbols. Their reputations traveled farther than their chains. The mere threat of being sent underground was enough to silence opposition, crush dissent, or bend wills. In this sense, dungeons achieved their purpose without even being entered. They haunted imaginations as much as they destroyed bodies. When reform finally came, it was not because rulers grew merciful, but because the horror had become undeniable. Writers, philosophers, and survivors exposed the truth. Public outrage began to stir. Slowly, painfully, society recognized that what had been called justice was in fact systemic brutality. Out of this recognition emerged the earliest foundations of human rights. But those rights were purchased at the cost of countless screams buried in stone. The echoes of dungeon cruelty reached far beyond their walls. Families left behind often lived in torment, never knowing if their loved ones were alive or dead. Mothers prayed outside castle gates, clutching coins for bribes that were rarely enough. children grew up with the shadow of the dungeon looming over their lives, learning that one accusation, one mistake, could drag anyone into darkness. Fear was inherited, passed like a curse through generations. Chroniclers of the time occasionally recorded these horrors, but often in whispers. Monks described oubliettes as the forgotten place not only because prisoners vanished inside, but because society was encouraged to forget them. To be thrown into such a hole was not just a physical fate, it was erasure from memory itself. Even language was bent toward cruelty, turning absence into punishment. One account tells of a nobleman accused of heresy who, after weeks in darkness, forgot his own name. When guards demanded he confess, he muttered nonsense, unable to remember why he had been imprisoned. He was executed anyway, though by then he was no longer the man they accused. The dungeon had killed his identity before the axe killed his body. Another tale speaks of a woman charged with witchcraft because her neighbor's cow had died. She endured ducking in icy water until her skin turned blue and her breath came in shudders. She confessed to anything they demanded, not out of guilt, but in desperation to breathe. Her words, forced through drowning lips, were used as proof of her guilt. Truth had no place in the dungeon, only survival. Even kings used dungeons to prove power. William Wallace, the Scottish hero, was dragged for hours through the streets before being disemboweled, hanged, and quartered. His punishment was not for military threat alone, but to etch terror into the minds of all who might resist English authority. The dungeon and scaffold worked together as instruments of domination, reminding people that the state could unmake a body in the most spectacular ways. The cruelty was not hidden, it was staged. Public executions drew crowds as though they were festivals. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to watch. Vendors sold food while victims screamed. Pain became entertainment, turning the suffering of the few into the spectacle of the many. It was not just rulers or torturers who sustained this system, it was society itself cheering as flesh was torn. Still, not all voices were silent. Some clerics questioned whether salvation could truly be born of agony. A few philosophers argued that law should protect rather than destroy. Their protests were often drowned in the roar of authority, yet the seeds were planted. Over time, these small doubts grew into movements that would one day challenge the very foundations of dungeon justice. The irony is sharp. The same civilization that built soaring cathedrals filled with light also carved caverns of despair beneath their floors. The same hands that painted masterpieces also designed machines of torment. This contradiction is the heart of the Middle Ages, a world of beauty and brutality, faith and fear existing side by side. To understand one, you must acknowledge the other. As centuries passed, some dungeons were abandoned, their entrances sealed their names, remembered only in rumor. Others became tourist sites where guides whispered tales of screams echoing in the stone. Visitors shivered at the thought of standing where countless had died. Yet the stones themselves remained silent, holding secrets no story could fully capture. The weight of centuries of pain cannot be erased by curious footsteps. The legacy of medieval dungeons is not merely historical, it is psychological. They reveal how easily institutions can justify cruelty, how quickly compassion can be twisted into violence, how thoroughly law can sanctify injustice. Their darkness lingers not in the chambers themselves, but in the human capacity to normalize horror. And that capacity, history warns us, is never truly gone. When the ashes of Savonarola were scattered into the Arno River, Florentines hoped memory would vanish with the smoke. But ideas do not disappear as easily as bodies. The notion of imprisonment as divine correction remained echoing through cathedrals and councils alike. The dungeon outlived its victims, becoming both warning and weapon for generations yet unborn. Merchants reopened their stalls. Craftsmen returned to their tools, and markets filled again with spice and bread. Yet behind every cheerful cry lay an unspoken truth. Wealth and art could be restored, but innocence could not. A society that had accepted systematic cruelty could never again claim it was untouched by blood. Decades later, elders told children about the fires that consumed not only objects, but also hope. They spoke of nights where laughter ceased, mornings where breath was held, afternoons where suspicion was deadlier than swords. Stories became warnings, and warnings became traditions, embedding fear into the cultural memory. Historians note how thin the line was between brilliance and brutality. A city could nurture Michelangelo, and in the same breath nurture inquisitors. A castle could shelter poets upstairs while prisoners starved below. It was not ignorance but choice, a choice to believe that cruelty served a higher cause. That choice, repeated often enough, became culture. Some chroniclers described dungeons not as mistakes but as necessities. They claimed order required terror, that heresy required purging, that poverty required punishment. In their words, cruelty became reason, and reason became law. The stone chambers beneath their feet were justified with ink and parchment above ground, and so the dungeon became a mirror reflecting the society that built it. Every rusted chain spoke of fear disguised as faith. Every oubliette testified to power's need to erase opposition. Every corpse dragged into a mass grave whispered of a civilization willing to trade compassion for control. The dungeon did not hide society's values, it revealed them in their truest form. In time, reformers arose. They argued that a justice system built on suffering was not justice at all. Philosophers and jurists planted the seeds of what would one day become human rights fair trials, presumption of innocence, and the belief that even the guilty deserved dignity. These ideas were fragile, and their roots shallow, but they offered a path out of the dark. Yet even as dungeons crumbled into ruins, their lessons endured. Modern prisons with bars and lights, laws with safeguards and rights exist because of the horrors uncovered in stone chambers centuries ago. We do not have humane systems because humanity triumphed naturally, but because humanity recoiled in horror at what it had done. The dungeon was the teacher, and its lessons were written in screams. But the question remains: have we truly left the dungeon behind? Or have we only renamed it, reshaped it, hidden it in policies and institutions that still grind people down in less visible ways? The medieval oubliette may be gone, but modern oubliettes exist wherever people are silenced, forgotten, or treated as disposable. The architecture of cruelty is adaptable, and it waits for silence to make it thrive again. So when you hear the drip of water in silence, when you see shadows in corners, remember the forgotten places. Remember the bodies carried away without names, the children who never saw daylight, the prisoners who traded dignity for a crumb of bread. The dungeon is not just history, it is warning. And if this journey into the darkest corners of the Middle Ages has opened your eyes, then, like, share and comment below. Most importantly, subscribe, because there are more forgotten truths waiting to be uncovered, and together we will drag them into the light.